Tonight at 10, the Chancellor hits business to raise tens of billions of pounds in one of the biggest tax-raising budgets in history.
Fixing the foundations of our economy, investing in our future, delivering change, rebuilding Britain.
They have raised tax to record levels. They have broken their promises, and it is the working people of this country that are going to pay the price.
I've been thinking about the best word to use to describe this budget, and it's this. It's big. It's really big. I'll bring you the key moments and my interview with the Chancellor in the next few minutes.
A kitchen sink budget, the numbers massive in every way, apart from the impact on growth, but the markets remain calm.
As people right across the UK digest today's budget, we are in Lowestoft on the Suffolk coast, finding out what it means for your finances and businesses.
It's going to be an increase. It's certainly a challenge to find that extra money.
Being a working mum, I think she's thought about that as well, and getting people back to work.
Also tonight, apocalyptic scenes in Spain. At least 95 people have died in flash floods after a year's worth of rain in just 8 hours, and dozens are still missing. And your voice, your BBC News. I've been to meet one viewer who got in touch about plans to put up hundreds of pylons across this Suffolk countryside.
On BBC London, following delays and uncertainty, the Chancellor says tunnelling for HS2 will continue from Old Oak Common to London Euston.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 10, live from the East Point Pavilion here in Lowestoft in Suffolk, the most easterly place in the United Kingdom. The first Labour budget for 14 years has laid out a string of tax rises to raise £40 billion a year. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, promised to restore economic stability and improve what she called broken public services, investing more in schools, the NHS and housing. The scale of today's budget is huge. Employers and businesses will carry a lot of the tax burden. Some £25 billion will come from a rise in employers' national insurance contributions. There's an increase to capital gains tax levied on profits from selling assets like shares. The inheritance tax threshold freeze will be extended by a further 2 years to 2030. And the Chancellor is abolishing the non-dom tax status. The Chancellor announced a raft of spending plans too. £22.6 billion will go to the NHS in England for its day-to-day spending. Investment in education to pay for maintenance and school buildings will increase to £6.7 billion in England next year. An extra £1 billion has also been earmarked for special educational needs. And £11.8 billion has been put aside to compensate victims of the infected blood scandal. There's £1.8 billion too for victims of the post office scandal. Well, the opposition leader, Rishi Sunak, described the budget as an enormous borrowing spree that contains broken promise after broken promise. Tonight, we are here in Lowestoft to look at what the budget means for you. We'll be getting reaction from people here in the town. But first, here's our political editor, Chris Mason, on the scale of today's announcements.
It isn't the most famous store on Downing Street, but the build-up on what's been going on behind it has been growing for weeks. The focus getting sharper on what would be in the budget and who is unveiling it. A genuine moment of history, this. Hundreds and hundreds of blokes for centuries and centuries have had a moment like this, delivering a budget as Chancellor, and yet this is the first time ever it's been done by a woman. And a big budget it is too. Big borrowing, big spending and big tax rises.
I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
The first budget from Labour in nearly 15 years. And a reminder, if you really mean it, say it 3 times.
The only way to drive economic growth is to invest, invest, invest.
Investing means spending, even if the hope is it'll lead to lots of long-term gains. And spending is necessary, Rachel Reeves claimed, because of all of the bills the Conservatives left them.
Their failure to assess the scale of the challenges facing our public services means that this budget raises taxes by £40 billion.
£40 billion, a colossal amount of money. This is a huge change-making budget, one way or the other. A massive money raiser for the Chancellor, hiking the national insurance paid by employers, both the rate and when it kicks in.
If the party opposite chooses to oppose this choice, then they are choosing more austerity, more chaos, more instability. This is the choice that our country faces too.
But it won't be a choice for some to pay more capital gains tax, inheritance tax or VAT on private school fees. So where is all this money going? There's some more for the Ministry of Defence, there's a rise in the minimum wage, and the Health Service is getting a big chunk more.
This is the largest real terms growth in day-to-day NHS spending outside of COVID since 2010.
But if you feared the cost of filling up going up, courtesy of the Chancellor, it isn't.
So I have decided today to freeze fuel duty next year, and I will maintain the existing 5% cut for another year too.
But the government has found a way to loads more money for longer-term spending, what they call investment, by changing their own rules on how much they can borrow. But just like for you and me, it costs to borrow money.
This is a moment of fundamental choice for Britain. Investing in our future, delivering change, rebuilding Britain. We on these benches commend those choices, and I commend this statement to the House.
Responding in his last big moment in the job, Rishi Sunak.
Time and again, we Conservatives warned Labour would tax, borrow and spend far beyond what they were telling the country. And time and again, they denied they had such plans. But today, the truth has come out. Proof that they planned to do this all along.
And here, the reaction from others.
We needed a different budget to repair the damage done to our country and to give people the fair deal they deserve. For our constituents, these benches will push the government to do far more for our economy, NHS and care. They are what Liberal Democrats will always champion.
I think it's a missed opportunity, unfortunately. I was looking for the Chancellor to introduce policies and a change to the taxation system that would create a fairer society and a greener economy.
She inherited a very challenging situation from the previous government. However, despite the fact that it is a very significant budget in terms of tax rises, if we consider the increase to the provision of public services and day-to-day spending, it is still quite modest.
This is the biggest tax rise in a generation. This is classic Labour, isn't it? Big tax, big spend.
I'm not disputing the fact that this is a big budget. It's the first budget of this Parliament. It wipes the slate clean under the fiction of the previous plans. But this is not a sort of budget that we would want to repeat, but this is the budget that is needed.
The Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent watchdog, says that growth in wages and salaries and profits are constrained by the increase in employer national insurance. You guys talk about yourselves being pro-business and pro-worker. The OBR don't believe it, so why should anyone else?
But if we had just reversed the unfunded cuts that the Conservatives made, that would have all been felt by working people.
So it's a might have been worse argument.
We have made the decision to put the tax burden that we're having to increase today on the wealthiest and on business.
The scrutiny is just beginning here as the crowds are departing and a new political landscape is emerging. Chris Mason, BBC News in Westminster.
Well, the Chancellor was on her feet for more than an hour and a quarter. It was one of the longest budget speeches in years. It was billed as a budget for growth. Is that what the UK will now get? Our economics editor Faisal Islam has been going through the numbers. Faisal.
Thanks, Sophie. This is what you might call a kitchen sink budget. A massive budget in almost every way, but does it deliver the Chancellor's repeated calls for more growth in the UK economy? The budget is certainly one of the largest tax-taking budgets in the post-war era. In fact, here are the largest 8 of the last 5 decades. And when we look at them from largest to smallest, this budget is actually the second largest, comfortably surpassing Dennis Healey's double in the 70s, Gordon Brown, Rishi Sunak mid-pandemic, only beaten by Norman Lamont over there in 1993. So why is this budget so big? Well, partly that's down to all the tax-raising measures, £40 billion, as we've been hearing, in a single year. We're showing you 28-29 as an example. It includes that employers' national insurance, raising £25 billion in a year, although £5 billion is paid by the government. We have capital gains and inheritance tax, raising £4 billion in that year, and the crackdown on non-doms, £3 billion in that year. But it's also a budget with some big spending going on. Departments will get an extra £49 billion a year to cover things like pay. Much of that will go to the NHS. There's £2 billion for compensation payments for infected blood and the post office scandal, and then £24 billion extra in this year for long-term investment in major capital projects, road, rail, hospitals. All of that added together far exceeds what's raised in tax by over £30 billion, and that will be funded by extra borrowing. It's worth a pause. These are all massive numbers on any ordinary scale, and keep an eye on this one, which happens every year and is enabled by the change in borrowing rules and will fund serious future investments. We can see the impact of that here. This is where borrowing was predicted to go before the budget. Now compare that to the new path for borrowing after this budget. Markedly up in every year, mainly for that investment. It's a big change, says the official forecaster.
It's one of the biggest budgets in history, measured in terms of the change in the orientation of fiscal policy. Certainly one of the biggest budgets the UK has seen, over 1% of GDP extra borrowing every year in each year of our forecast.
And the biggest tax rise in history.
Yeah, tax is heading up to a record high of 38% of GDP. That's the highest it's ever been in the post-war period.
So big changes, aimed to foster growth. Does it? Well, here's the growth forecast from March. And this is the changed forecast by the OBR today. The extra spending has helped in the next 2 years, but it's actually a little lower in 3 or 4 years' time. Certainly no boom. The Chancellor hopes to defy these forecasts, but much of the investment will take closer to a decade to fully boost the economy. Think transport projects or a new energy grid. And just as we come on air tonight, some rare backing from the international financial body, the IMF, for this tax-raising budget. So a significant change of numbers, of policy, of economic approach. And so far, the new Chancellor seems to have landed it with the markets, but we wait for that growth impact.
Faisal Islam, our economics editor, thank you. Well, it is businesses that will bear the brunt of the tax rises, with changes to employers' national insurance contributions and business rates. And on top of that, there's the rise in the minimum wage. Our business editor, Simon Jack, has been gauging reaction.
The mood was jolly among customers at this pub tonight, but the mood of the owner of this and another pub and restaurant was decidedly less buoyant, who said today's budget was going to hit his business hard.
It's catastrophic, and it's catastrophic for small businesses. We're going to have to absorb this cost through a number of measures. We may have to reduce costs, redundancies, reduced hours. We're going to have to increase prices, and then we're going to have to look for further efficiencies.
It's not relaxing news for the owner of this chain of spas, who employs 160 people and says this budget will cost her £300,000 a year.
Her first words were invest, 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 right? Because she knows that you can't grow unless you're investing. But I ask her, how can I invest if you've just taken all of my tax? If you've just taken all of our profits in tax, how can I invest in my business to grow it?
This new government has always insisted it's possible to be pro-business, pro-growth and pro-worker, but with a massive increase in national insurance, an inflation-busting rise in the minimum wage and a plethora of new employment rights, it's making it more expensive and more complex to hire people, and that will deter more jobs and more growth.
But government promises to map out a brighter future and invest billions in crucial infrastructure got a more positive response.
What we did hear from the Chancellor was some of the other things we have been asking for, so that long-term strategy, an industrial strategy, and that investment, so investment in infrastructure and building schools, hospitals, homes, and that's really important because that drives supply chains of SMEs and local economic growth.
Businesses are footing a hefty bill and are dearly hoping the government won't be coming back for more. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, the NHS and schools will receive a lot more money. The Chancellor says the Education Department will see its budget increase in real terms by 19%. That includes money for rebuilding more than 500 schools. And there's an extra £22 billion for the NHS's day-to-day budget. More on this now from our Education Editor, Branwen Jeffries, and our Health Editor, Hugh Pym.
The NHS in previous winters, queues of ambulances at hospitals. Ministers say the budget won't ease pressure this time. But the government hopes the measures will help the NHS do more planned operations and bring down waiting lists. The target is 40,000 more appointments and procedures each week by the end of the first year in power. The Chancellor announced £25.7 billion more for the Department of Health in England over 2 years, with annual increases after inflation of 3.8%. That's actually in line with the historical average.
Ministers hope that with their investment, including some on new kit and buildings, they can hit their target by next July. Health organisations have welcomed it, but pointed out that some of it will have to cover NHS pay, including the junior doctors' increase, and it's not clear how much that'll leave for cutting waiting lists.
There was nothing today on NHS reform. The government is drawing up a 10-year plan, but that won't be published till the spring.
The most vulnerable children, staff overstretched. The system for special educational needs is close to breaking point. Today came a cash injection of £1 billion. That's on top of £10.7 billion a year already being spent.
This did come as a surprise today, and it will help provide some short-term relief in a system that really isn't coping. But it won't wipe out £4 billion of deficits sitting in local authorities, and it's not the long-term reform that so many people say is needed.
From just falling apart to dodgy concrete and asbestos, some schools across England are in a poor state. Spending to fix them will rise to £6.7 billion. Head teachers warned today that will still mean slow progress. And from January, private school fees will attract VAT. Armed Forces families will get some extra support.
Branwen Jeffries and Hugh Pym there. Now let's take a look at some of the other main measures announced in this budget today. The surcharge on stamp duty for second homes in England and Northern Ireland will go up to 5% as of tomorrow. Unspent pension pots will be subject to inheritance tax from April 2027. And rail links between York, Leeds, Huddersfield and Manchester will be upgraded. Rail fares will go up by 4.6% next March. After describing potholes as a visible symbol of failure to invest in the nation, the Chancellor said £500 million has been put aside for road maintenance. A flat rate duty on vaping liquid will begin from October 2026, with taxes on tobacco also going up. And there were cheers in the Commons as the Chancellor announced draft duty on alcoholic drinks would fall by 1.7%, meaning a penny off a pint in the pub. Well, our cost of living correspondent Coletta Smith has been talking to people here in Lowestoft about how their finances will be affected.
This is a town that gets active early. And for the Reynolds family, breakfast is served.
I don't want to hold you back. Are you heading out any second now?
He's all right for a minute.
Becky runs her own party business.
Quite savvy as a mum and obviously a business owner to make sure you're getting the best out of everything.
And Sam works for an electrical company.
Next year is remortgage time.
So it's been all hands on deck.
I help them put the chair covers in the chairs.
To keep the finances on track.
I actually took another job on this year. I used to work in a pub. I would work all hours from 6:30 till 12, and then I'd then do all the school run the next day. But my business needed it.
We'll catch you a bit later on today, after the budget.
I am taking steps to support people with the cost of living.
Most people here are watching a very different performance at this community theatre. But with 7 staff to pay, Des is keeping an eye on the budget too.
So overall, is it going to cost you more as a business?
Staff will see a pay rise, and obviously that's going to have a knock-on impact on other salaries as we go through the scale.
Helen runs music sessions here and is a carer herself.
The strain that put on me and my family has been immense, but it's so hidden.
People are going to be allowed to earn more as a carer. How does that feel?
For your well-being, it can be a really, really good thing to be able to go to work and contribute and be part of something. But the restrictions that have previously been around the amount of hours that you're allowed to work before you're disqualified, I think it's a really good message. I think carers need to be more valued, particularly family carers.
You just sort of learn to live within your means.
For Scott, the increase in benefit payments in April will help.
I don't know how much that will be sort of on top of my overly monthly income, but, you know, great. You know, if it's going to be a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more.
At the other end of the county, George got in touch with us through Your Voice, Your BBC News. He and his partner are trying to buy their first home.
That's great, building more properties, but you need to make sure those properties are affordable. First-time buyers are not expecting the government to hand us a house. We're just expecting, hopefully, a little bit more help towards that goal of home ownership.
So we double knot our bows so they don't fall.
Across town, I'm catching up with Becky again at her party business.
I felt she went on there and actually really smashed it. Childcare for being a mum, breakfast clubs, it's going to be absolutely fantastic for me, especially when Thomas gets older. Also the support in the schools, helping the schools is going to help me. Giving people a higher wage, that customer's now going to spend more money.
You're not a Labour voter. You were nervous about this budget?
Yes, I was, yeah, definitely, without a doubt. I didn't know what to expect. A few things that she has changed will help us, actually.
A Chancellor promising to steady the ship. And for many people, perhaps not the choppy waters they'd feared.
Coletta's with me now. How soon will people notice a difference to their finances?
Well, some of those changes you've mentioned, the changes in alcohol duty will kick in February, but most of the others kick in April. So people have a little bit of time to plan, and businesses have time to plan for it too. So the big change that we're seeing in the national living wage, the minimum wage, that goes up in April, as well as those national insurance contributions by employers. There's also been announcements about council funding, that extra £1.3 billion, that will come in April. A lot of that going to special needs funding, but also, as you mentioned, potholes and affordable housing within that too. There's also been an extension to the Household Support Fund. That's an extra £1 billion. That's coming from the 1st of April and will last a full year. A big extension there, and that funds a real welfare safety net across the UK, funding lots of food banks right the way across the UK. Further down along the horizon, there is a review about how people are going to be assessed for their disability payments, so we may see some big cuts there for people. And of course, the question mark around whether businesses will cut people's hours, whether they'll take on fewer staff. So it's a budget that is not without risk, but potentially a big potential boost for lower income households who've been juggling very tight budgets for the last couple of years.
Coletta Smith, thank you. Well, extra spending in England means more funding for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. £6.6 billion in total in devolution payments. Well, let's get reaction from the devolved nations, starting with our Scotland editor James Cook in Aberdeen.
Here in Aberdeen, the home of the UK's oil and gas industry, there is concern about Rachel Reeves pushing up the overall level of taxation on the industry to 78%. They've been lobbying furiously here, though, and while she has scrapped some tax breaks for investment, she is keeping some others. More generally, people in Scotland may have to wait until the Scottish Government's budget in December before they understand the full impact of this budget. That's because a lot is controlled in Edinburgh, some welfare payments, income tax and levels of public spending on schools, hospitals and so on. The Scottish Finance Secretary, Shona Robertson, says this budget is a step in the right direction. Why is that? Well, because Rachel Reeves says it will mean an extra £1.5 billion in spending for the Scottish Government this year and £3.4 billion next year. And that means, with the Scottish parliamentary elections coming along in just 18 months' time, we can expect debate about how that money should be spent and who should take the credit.
Back in the general election, Labour claimed being in government here in Wales and in Westminster would deliver a real difference. Today was the first big test of that. So what's the result? The Chancellor's plans will give the Welsh Government an extra £1.7 billion to spend as it wants. But we know most will go into the Welsh NHS, where there are record waiting lists for treatment, some patients waiting for more than 2 years. What today didn't bring was an end to the row over rail and the money Labour has said Wales is owed because of HS2 spending in England. It used to say Wales should be given billions of pounds. That came down to hundreds of millions, but today there was no extra money because of HS2. There was a pledge on another long-standing issue, £25 million to maintain old coal tips, an effort to clean up the legacy of Wales's industrial past.
The power-sharing devolved government in Northern Ireland is now looking relatively stable after being absent for 5 out of the last 7 years. The Chancellor has told ministers here at Stormont that next year they'll get an additional £1.5 billion to spend, and that'll bring the total funding package to the highest ever level in real terms. Local political leaders have said it'll take some time to work through the details of what that means for running public services. The Westminster government's also giving more money to the police service of Northern Ireland. There'll be an extra £7 million for the fund, which helps it to tackle national security threats, including from dissident Republican paramilitaries who are opposed to the peace process. And there's been a wide welcome for an announcement in relation to regeneration schemes for local councils, known as city and growth deals. There are 4 in Northern Ireland, 2 had been on hold, but now we know they will go ahead, and they're worth hundreds of millions of pounds.
Chris Page there. Well, how has it all gone down? Let's speak to our political editor, Chris Mason, for his assessment. Chris.
Yes, hello to you. I think the key thing to reflect on is what we've been talking about really for the last 15-20 minutes, which is the scale of this budget, and that's what people here are reflecting on, and that stamped through it are Labour's instincts, their worldview, this idea of a bigger state, bigger borrowing, bigger taxes and bigger spending. And Labour MPs, when they see this, they flick through it and see that it's not just red in colour, as it always is on the front cover, but feels very red in its politics. And after 15 years without a Labour government, they are happy with that. But this is the moment of maximum scrutiny and potential jeopardy for the Chancellor after this budget. And I noticed, for instance, one little wrinkle tonight. There is real anger, a breadth of anger amongst many farmers about changes to inheritance tax that they say could have a really big impact on them. That's a row I'm going to keep watching. And the scrutiny for Rachel Reeves will continue into the morning. She'll be here on BBC One on breakfast. It's about 7:30 and on the radio too. And then that will continue in the days ahead. One final point, when you look at the forecasts, growth remains an issue, as Faisal has been talking about, in the coming years. That's the central mission of this government. And disposable household income, money that you have in your pocket or crucially feel that you don't have in your pocket, is not growing particularly quickly. And if the government can't help shift either or both of those things, they could end up with a very cheesed off electorate come the next election.
Chris Mason, thank you. Victoria Derbyshire will have plenty more analysis on Newsnight coming up on BBC Two shortly. Victoria.
Yeah, I will be interviewing some of the key players in the budget and asking where is the growth in what Rachel Reeves calls a budget for growth. Plus, as Chris just mentioned, anger amongst some farmers over inheritance tax changes. I'll ask the Chief Secretary to the Treasury about that and many other things. Join us on Newsnight in about 3 minutes on BBC Two and iPlayer. See you then.
Victoria, thank you. And now to Rita with more of today's news. Rita.
Sophie, thank you. In Spain, at least 95 people have died in flash floods that have devastated parts of the south and the east. Rescuers are still searching for the missing after mudslides and torrents of water swept away bridges and left cars piled up on each other. Parts of the Valencia region received a year's worth of rain in 8 hours yesterday. A British man has been confirmed among the dead in Malaga. Our climate editor Justin Rolat reports.
These flash floods were truly apocalyptic. One town got a year's worth of rain in just 8 hours. Just watch what happens to this bridge. These images have been widely shared on social media. there was little warning. One local mayor said the first flood alert was just half an hour before the torrent arrived. Rescuers have been scrambling to pluck people and their pets from the surging tide of filthy water all day. Just look at the wreckage the floods left in their wake. It is a terrifying reminder of the extreme weather climate change could bring, say scientists.
We're seeing a warming climate which holds more moisture in the atmosphere, and we're seeing more severe storms happening more often. And this isn't just the devastating floods that we've seen in southern Spain, but also across the UK and other parts of the world.
The whole of Spain weeps with you, the Spanish Prime Minister told the families of the missing this afternoon. The rescue effort will continue into the night. Justin Rowlatt, BBC News.
We can speak now to our correspondent Bethany Bell, who's in Valencia for us now. Terrible scenes there, Bethany. What is the situation right now?
Well, this is already being described as one of the worst natural disasters in Spain's history. I'm standing not very far from the river in Valencia, and the water must have rushed down this street with such force that it lifted cars off the ground, and there's destruction in areas across this region. In one village not too far from here, 40 people are known to have died, including a number people at a nursing home. And in the meantime, the painstaking search for the missing goes on. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has sent his condolences to those who have lost their loved ones, and he said that Spain weeps with you. And the country has declared 3 days of national mourning, and the cleanup is likely to take weeks and months.
Bethany, thank you. Bethany Bell in Valencia for us. An 18-year-old accused of murdering 3 girls at a dance class in Southport appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court today, charged with 2 more offences. Axel Rudakubana, who appeared via video link from Belmarsh Prison, has been charged with production of the poison ricin and possessing an analysis of an Al-Qaeda training manual, a PDF document likely to be useful to someone committing or preparing an act of terrorism. He's due to appear at Liverpool Crown Court on November the 13th. The first case of a new strain of Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, has been detected in the UK. The patient, who'd recently been on holiday in Africa, developed flu-like symptoms and a rash after flying home. They're being treated at the Royal Free Hospital Infectious Diseases Unit in London. The patient's close contacts are being traced. Time now to go back to Sophie and the team in Lowestoft. Sophie.
Rita, thank you. Invest, invest, invest. That is what the Chancellor said today as she vowed to drive growth by investing in infrastructure and making Britain a clean energy superpower. A huge amount of investment is already being poured into building wind farms off this coast here in Suffolk to power millions of homes right across the UK. Well, Rosie Pearson got in touch with us earlier this year through Your Voice, Your BBC News about plans to put up 100 miles of pylons here. She's leading a campaign against the scheme. I've been hearing the differing views in the area. 25 miles off the Suffolk coast, a giant wind farm the size of 40,000 football pitches. These vast turbines are helping to turn the UK away from fossil fuels to green energy. Scottish Power is one of several companies now building more wind farms to meet the government's net zero targets.
We need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and really stabilise the energy price and reduce costs to consumers. So we can develop these projects, develop these wind farms. It's really about increasing grid capacity and making sure the onshore infrastructure grows at the pace we need to support these projects in the future.
But plans to get all this energy on land and into millions of homes are making some local people unhappy. The National Grid wants to put up more than 100 miles of pylons across this countryside, from Norfolk, Suffolk to Essex.
That and the other, so.
Campaigners say they support the green energy project, but they want the electricity carried underground.
It's unimaginable devastation. We will see hedgerows taken out, woodlands taken out, farms cut in half. I have been to many villages up and down the route over the past few years, and we've had people in tears, people whose livelihoods have been destroyed.
We've got hens for eggs, and we raise chickens for meat.
Living off-grid with his family was Gareth Presley's dream, but now his 4-acre small holding is directly in the path of the planned pylons.
We have pylons being erected either side of our land. This field that we own, this will be devastated. It'll be gone, effectively bulldozed.
National Grid insists it has considered all options, and pylons are better value for money for bill payers than underground cabling or lines under the sea. Other pylon projects are being planned across the UK as the government pushes on with its plans for net zero. But it's leaving some communities grappling with the pace of change. I'm joined now by Ben Schofield, the political correspondent for BBC East. And you can see the real tension here, can't you?
Absolutely. Communities grappling with the pace of change and also grappling with that ambition to become a clean energy superpower. Realising that ambition will take massive amounts of new infrastructure. The National Grid calls their plans the Great Grid Upgrade. That's the new pylons here in the east and others elsewhere. We're also talking mega solar farms, potential onshore wind as well. Controversy about these sorts of schemes is nothing new. The previous Chancellor was talking about a compensation scheme, perhaps £1,000 a year off energy bills for affected homes. No such detail like that from the current government, though. The Treasury told me this afternoon it would outline its position on those sorts of things in due course. The Department for Energy said that it understood that it's important to take people with them when it comes to these sorts of plans, and it was looking at how communities could benefit. But you get the idea that these sorts of rows could rumble on for some time.
Ben Schofield, thank you. Time now for a look at the weather with Louise Lear.
Thanks, Sophie. Well, there's been quite a lot of cloud around. Few favoured spots for sunshine. Aberdeen was one, Powys was another. Beautiful afternoon, but most of us saw grey skies. And through the night tonight, we will see a return to some mist and fog. So it's a murky old start to our Thursday morning. Rather cloudy but mild story, though, is set to continue, all because of this area of high pressure. Very little in the way of wind across England and Wales tomorrow, not shifting the fog very quickly. But further north and west, we've got windier conditions. Here we'll see some cloud and some rain pushing into the northern and perhaps the Western Isles later on in the afternoon. But elsewhere, the fog will lift, the cloud will break up from time to time and allow for some sunny spells to come through, and pleasant enough once again, 15 or 16 degrees above where we should be for closing out late October. Now, as we move into Friday, the high pressure starts to drift away. That weather front will bring some outbreaks of rain, sinking its way slowly south out of Scotland, but it's weakening all the time. Really, by around 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, be sitting down towards the borders, but behind it, quite a clearance. Cooler but sunnier conditions here. Now, elsewhere, we're going to be chasing cloud amounts around once again. So it's a rather cloudy, grey, mild scenario continuing across much of the country. And again, we'll see temperatures around 14 or 15 degrees. A little bit cooler in Scotland, but it's not going to last because the high pressure is drifting away. And as it moves over into the near continent, it's going to allow a bit more of a southeasterly wind direction. That will hopefully break up some of the cloud as we go into the weekend. So a bit of a grey start on Saturday, improving picture on Sunday. Back to you, Sophie.
Louise, thank you. That's it from us. So the BBC News at 10 here in Lowestoft. Right now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Good night.